It's Monday. Let's just pretend like I didn't skip a couple of Mondays and that I was right on time with the Monday video for all you people who follow. And then let's get right to the good part. This is the penultimate chapter, one of my favorite words ever, penultimate, meaning next to last. Penultimate. And it's, so we were talking about the harvest. And in the Little House in the Big Woods by Laura Ingalls Wilder, in the previous chapter, The Harvest, the different brothers kind of help each other bring in the harvest, and it describes how they cut the grain and they bundle it together and they stack it up so the rain doesn't get to it and things like that. And there was a cousin who was messing around instead of working, and so he kind of got his just desserts in the end. He was crying wolf a bit, and then he ended up needing some help, and it was a good time. Go listen to it if you missed it. But so we're still in the harvest for this chapter. We are talking about the wonderful machine, and the wonderful machine. Here's a picture, and it's it's a harvester, an early harvester, and early farmers like Pa. Didn't have their own harvester. Now a lot of farmers have their own equipment because their farms are so large and they have a lot of machinery and they work their own, they have lots and lots of fields, so they own the machinery that they use all the time. In this case, nobody owned it. I believe Pa sends for it. So let's find out. Let's get started. Okay. Next day, Pa cut the heads from several bundles of the oats and brought the clean, bright yellow straws to Ma. She put them in a tub of water to soften them and keep them soft. Then she sat in the chair by the side of the tub and braided the straws. She took up several of them, knotted their ends together, and began to braid. The straws were different lengths, and when she came near the end of one straw, she put a new long one from the tub in its place and went on braiding. She let the end of the braid fall back into the water and kept on braiding till she had many yards of braid. All her spare time, for days, she was braiding straws. She made a fine, narrow, smooth braid, using 7 of the smallest straws. She used 9 larger straws for a wider braid and made it notched all along the edges. I don't really understand what that would look like. We'll see if they tell us. And from the very largest straw, she made the widest braid of all. When all the straws were braided, she threaded a needle with strong white thread, and beginning at the end of a braid, she sewed it round and round, holding the braid so it would lie flat after it was sewed. This made a little mat, and Ma said it was the top of the crown of a hat. Oh, I see. Then she held the braid tighter on one edge and kept on sewing it around and around. The braid drew in and made the sides of the crown. When the crown was high enough, Ma held the braid loosely again as she kept on sewing around, and the braid lay flat and was the hat brim. When the brim was wide enough, Ma cut the braid and sewed the end fast so it could not unbraid itself. Ma sewed hats for Mary and Laura of the finest and narrowest braid. For Pa and for herself she made hats of the wider notched braid. That was Pa's Sunday hat. Then she made him 2 everyday hats of the coarser, wider braid. When she finished a hat, Ma set it on a board to dry, shaping it nicely as she did so, and when it dried, it stayed in the shape she gave it. Ma could make beautiful hats. Laura liked to watch her, and she learned how to braid the straw and made a little hat for Charlotte. So that's really the way. That's the way that they would learn how to do things. Mary and Laura and all the other children of this time period, they would help their parents with their daily tasks, kind of like if you went with your parents to work and they gave you some small tasks from their job to do, and gradually as you got older, the tasks would get more and more like your parents' tasks, and eventually you'd be able to do all the jobs yourself. So when Ma is making hats, then Mary and Laura are also making hats, but they're making hats for their dolls, so it doesn't really matter if they do a great job, but they still get to practice and feel like they're helping, and it's good fun. I think it sounds like fun to make a hat. I wish I could do that. I guess I could. The days were growing shorter. Oh, I'm sorry. I'll show you the hat picture now. So there's some hats drying. The days were growing shorter and the nights were cooler. One night, Jack Frost passed by, and in the morning there were bright colors here and there among the green leaves of the big woods. Then all the leaves stopped being green. They were yellow and scarlet and crimson and golden and brown. Along the rail fence, I don't know what this word is. The sumac? Sumac? Sumac. I'll have to look that one up for you. Along the rail fence, the sumac? I don't know. Held up its dark red cones of berries above bright flame-colored leaves. Acorns were falling from the oaks, and Laura and Mary made little acorn cups and saucers for the playhouses. Walnuts and hickory nuts were, I have a song about a hickory tree. It's the let us chase the squirrel, up the hickory, down the hickory. And so here they are. They have hickory trees in Wisconsin. So now I know. Walnuts and hickory nuts were dropping to the ground in the big woods, and squirrels were scampering busily everywhere, gathering their winter store of nuts and hiding them away in hollow trees. Laura and Mary went with Ma to gather walnuts and hickory nuts and hazelnuts. They spread them in the sun to dry, then they beat off the dried outer hulls and stored the nuts in the attic for winter. It was fun to gather the large round walnuts and the smaller hickory nuts, and the little hazelnuts that grew in bunches on the bushes. I did not know hazelnuts grew on bushes. I'm learning tons of stuff. The soft outer hulls of the walnuts were full of a brown juice that stained their hands. They still use walnut dye. Sometimes the juice is a good dye. But the hazelnut hull smelled good and tasted good too when Laura used her teeth to pry a nut loose. Everyone was busy now, for all the garden vegetables must be stored away. Laura and Mary helped picking up the dusty potatoes after Pa had dug them from the ground, and pulling the long yellow carrots and the round purple-topped turnips, and they helped Ma cook the pumpkin for pumpkin pies. With the butcher knife, Ma cut the big orange-colored pumpkins into halves. She cleaned the seeds out of the center and cut the pumpkin into long slices, from which she pared the rind. Laura helped her cut the slices into cubes. Ma put the cubes into the big iron pot on the stove, poured in some water, and then watched while the pumpkin slowly boiled down all day long. All the water and the juice must be boiled away, and the pumpkin must never burn. The pumpkin was a thick, dark, good-smelling mass in the kettle. It did not boil like water, but bubbles came up in it and suddenly exploded, leaving holes that closed quickly. Every time a bubble exploded, the rich, hot pumpkin smell came out. Laura stood on a chair and watched the pumpkin for Ma and stirred it with a wooden paddle. She held the paddle in both hands and stirred carefully, because if the pumpkin burned, there wouldn't be any pumpkin pies. For dinner, they ate the stewed pumpkin with their bread. They made it into pretty shapes on their plates. It was a beautiful color and smoothed and molded so prettily with their knives. Ma never allowed them to play with their food at table. They must always eat nicely everything that was set before them, leaving nothing on their plates. But she did let them make the rich brown stewed pumpkin into pretty shapes before they ate it. That's kind of a special treat. At other times, they had baked Hubbard squash for dinner. The rind was so hard that Ma had to take Pa's axe to cut the squash into pieces. Wow, that's pretty intense. When the pieces were baked in the oven, Laura loved to spread the soft insides with butter and then scoop the yellow flesh from the rind and eat it. Oh, that sounds really good. For supper now, they often had hulled corn and milk. That was good too. It was so good that Laura could hardly wait for the corn to be ready after Ma started to hull it. It took 2 or 3 days to make hulled corn. The first day, Ma cleaned and brushed all the ashes out of the cook stove. Then she burned some clean, bright hardwood and saved its ashes. She put the hardwood ashes in a little cloth bag. That night, Pa brought in some ears of corn with large plump kernels. He nubbed the ears, shelling off the small, chafy kernels at their tips. Then he shelled the rest into a large pan until the pan was full. Early next day, Ma put the shelled corn and the bag of ashes into the big iron kettle. She filled the kettle with water and kept it boiling for a long time. At last the kernels of corn began to swell, and they swelled and swelled until their skins split open and began to peel off. When every skin was loose and peeling, Ma lugged the heavy kettle outdoors. She filled a clean washtub with cold water from the spring, and she dipped the corn out of the kettle into the tub. Then she rolled the sleeves of her flowered calico dress above her elbows, and she knelt by the tub. With her hands she rubbed and scrubbed the corn until the hulls came off and floated on top of the water. Often she poured the water off and filled the tub again with buckets of water from the spring. She kept on rubbing and scrubbing the corn between her hands and changing the water until every hull came off and was washed away. Ma looked pretty, with her bare arms plump and white, her cheeks so red and her dark hair smooth and shining, while she scrubbed and rubbed the corn in the clear water. She never splashed one drop of water on her pretty dress. I don't know that she never dropped or splashed one drop. Maybe just one. Maybe. When at last the corn was done, Ma put all the soft white kernels in a big jar in the pantry. Then at last they had hulled corn and milk for supper. Sometimes they had hulled corn for breakfast with maple syrup, and sometimes Ma fried the soft kernels in pork drippings, but Laura liked them best with milk. Autumn was great fun. There was so much work to do, so many good things to eat, so many new things to see. Laura was scampering and chattering like the squirrels from morning to night. One frosty morning a machine came up the road. 4 horses were pulling it, and 2 men were on it. The horses hauled it up into the field where Pa and Uncle Henry and Grandpa and Mr. Peterson had stacked their wheat. 2 more men drove after it another, smaller machine. Pa called to Ma that the threshers had come. Then he hurried to the field with his team. Laura and Mary asked Ma, and then they ran out to the field after him. They might watch if they were careful not to get in the way. Uncle Henry came riding up and tied his horse to a tree. Then he and Pa hitched all the other horses, 8 of them, to the smaller machine. One thing I like about this book is that, they must have known, Uncle Henry must have known the day to come. But because this is from Laura's point of view, she doesn't ever really know what day it is. Day of the week, yes, there's Sunday, but she doesn't understand the months or the what date is it today. She would never know the date, and so all of it sort of seems just magical. Like people just show up and they just know when they're going to so and so's house and whatever. And some of that is true. They would have to just know oh, today's a good day to go do this, and they would show up. But other things they would have to have prearranged, like this machine. And Laura just doesn't know about that process, and so it's not revealed to us. And it to us it seems like, oh, they just showed up, but so I really like what the author did there, how she knows a little bit more than Laura, but or we know a little bit more than Laura but everything is still from Laura's perspective, and everything we know more than Laura is because we have experiences that we're drawing on to infer things, and Laura is too little to know. So anyway, sorry, nerdy teacher moment there. I'm going to move on. Okay. Oh, they hitched each team to the end of a long stick that came out from the center of the machine. A long iron rod lay along the ground from this machine to the big machine. Oh, I see. Afterward, Laura and Mary asked questions, and Pa told them that the big machine was called the separator, and the rod was called the tumbling rod, and the little machine was called the horsepower. 8 horses were hitched to it and made it go. So this was an 8-horsepower machine. We still use that word horsepower, but we use it about cars, and so you'll hear 40 horsepower. Or I don't know anything about cars really, so I don't know what's inappropriate. But so you'll hear so many horsepower engine, and this is an 8-horsepower engine, but it's really horse-powered as opposed to, of course, our cars run on gasoline. Interesting. A man sat on top of the horsepower, and when everything was ready, he clucked to the horses, and they began to go. They walked around him in a circle, each team pulling on the long stick to which it was hitched, and following the team ahead. As they went around, they stepped carefully over the tumbling rod, which was tumbling over and over on the ground. I'm going to show you the picture so you can see. So here is the horsepower. And you can see all the horses are hitched up to these rods that go to the center. And then whatever this turning motion is transferred to this rod, and it's going around and around. And then this power will be connected over to this machine, and it will work something on this machine that makes it go. And our machines still work that way. Most of them, we just don't use horses anymore. We use electricity, or sometimes we use water. Yeah, pretty cool. Okay, their pulling made the tumbling rod keep rolling over, and the rod moved the machinery of the separator, which stood beside the stack of wheat. All this machinery made an enormous racket, rackety banging. That's a cool word. Rackety banging and clanging. Laura and Mary held tight to each other's hand at the edge of the field and watched with all their eyes. They had never seen a machine before. Can you imagine? They had never heard such a racket. Pa and Uncle Henry on top of the wheat stack were pitching bundles down onto a board. A man stood at the board and cut the bands on the bundles and crowded the bundles one at a time into a hole at the end of the separator. The hole looked like the separator's mouth, and it had long iron teeth. The teeth were chewing. They chewed the bundles, and the separator swallowed them. Straw blew out the separator's other end, and wheat poured out of its side. The two men were working fast, trampling the straw and building it into a stack. One man was working fast, sacking the pouring grain. The grains of wheat poured out of the separator into a half-bushel measure, and as fast as the measure filled, the men slipped an empty one into its place and emptied the full one into a sack. A bushel is a sack of a certain size, and it used to be a common form of measurement, but now we don't really use it anymore. He had just time to empty it and slip it back under the spout before the other measure ran over. All the men were working as fast as they possibly could, but the machine kept right up with them. Laura and Mary were so excited they could hardly breathe. They held hands tightly and stared. The horses walked around and around. The man who was driving them cracked his whip and shouted, "Giddy up there, John! No use trying to shirk!" Crack went the whip. "Careful there, Billy! Easy, boy! You can't go but so fast, nohow!" The separator swallowed the bundles, and golden straw blew out in a golden cloud. The wheat streamed golden brown out of the spout, while the men hurried. Pa and Uncle Henry pitched bundles down as fast as they could, and chaff. Chaff is the, like the shells on the wheat. It's sometimes you get a little bit of chaff when you're eating oatmeal. It's like the little piece that you can't chew. That's chaff, and it's supposed to blow away. Okay. Laura and Mary watched as long as they could. Then they ran back to the house to help Ma get dinner for all those men. A big kettle of cabbage and meat was boiling on the stove. A big pan of beans and a Johnny cake were baking in the oven. Laura and Mary set the table for the threshers. They put on salt-rising bread and butter, bowls of stewed pumpkin, pumpkin pies and dried berry pies, and cookies, cheese, and honey, and pitchers of milk. Then Ma put on the boiled potatoes and cabbage and meat, the baked beans, the hot Johnny cake, and the baked Hubbard squash, and she poured the tea. Laura always wondered why bread made of cornmeal was called Johnny cake. It wasn't cake. Ma didn't know, unless the Northern soldiers called it Johnny cake because the people in the South where they fought ate so much of it. They called the Southern soldiers Johnny Rebs. Maybe they called the Southern bread cake just for fun. Ma had heard some say it should be called journey cake. She didn't know. It wouldn't be very good bread to take on a journey. At noon, the threshers came in to the table loaded with food, but there was none too much, for threshers work hard and get very hungry. By the middle of the afternoon, the machines had finished all the threshing, and the men who owned them drove them away into the big woods, taking with them the sacks of wheat that were their pay. They were going to the next place, where neighbors had stacked their wheat and wanted the machines to thresh it. Pa was very tired that night, but he was happy. He said to Ma, "It would have taken Henry and Peterson and Pa and me a couple of weeks apiece to thresh as much grain with flails as that machine threshed today. We wouldn't have got as much wheat either, and it wouldn't have been as clean. That machine's a great invention," he said. "Other folks can stick to old-fashioned ways if they want to, but I'm all for progress. It's a great age we're living in. As long as I raise wheat, I'm going to have a machine come and thresh it if there's one anywhere in the neighborhood." He was too tired that night to talk to Laura, but Laura was proud of him. It was Pa who had got the other men to stack their wheat together and send for the threshing machine, and it was a wonderful machine. Everybody was glad it had come. And that's the end of the chapter, Wonderful Machine. Now remember, this was the penultimate chapter, so there's only one more, chapter 13, The Deer in the Wood. And it's a short one, so we're gonna say goodbye to Laura and Mary in the next week. But next week I'll do a little spiel about the other ones, and then we'll get started on Pippi Longstocking. Remember, that's coming up. So stay tuned. I'm going to do every Monday again. Not going to promise, but that's my goal. And so hopefully I'll see you next Monday. If you liked what you saw or didn't like what you saw, leave me a comment down below. And I'm always open to suggestions. I've heard from a couple people, hey, I don't really like the book, but I like listening to you read, so I don't listen. And I thought, well, that's silly. Tell me a book you would like to hear me read, and I will read it. So I'd love to hear your input. And other than that, have a great Monday. Bye, guys.